Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to the Scary Stories Best of May and June 2-hour special. I'm Henrey Lee Dogman, and I'll be your host for today. Before we get started with our best of, we have an all-new story. Let's get to that right away. It's called Trapped by the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this is a story that happened to me about 10 years ago as my wife and I were driving cross-country to celebrate our retirement. The trip had been uneventful up till this happened, even boring. But we stopped minding boredom after we came face to face with the Dogman. So we started our drive from our home in New Jersey. We wanted to travel smaller highways and byways and get to see America in a more old-fashioned sense. We were only a day and a half into our journey, wandering through Pennsylvania and looking for a hotel or motel when the engine on our old Toyota started running down. I managed to pull off the road by the old-growth forest as it conked out completely and sputtered to a halt. My wife tried to call our car service, but couldn't get any bars on her cell phone. It was the same with mine. I cursed myself for trying such a trip with that old car. We really should have rented an up-to-date vehicle, but I'd never had a car problem in my life, and I foolishly assumed my luck would continue. I got out of the car and opened the hood, but I have no idea how a car engine works, so that was a pretty pointless move. My wife told me the battery was dead, and I assumed that she was correct, but I had no idea. This was really only about the 10th time I had ever driven in my entire life, as I had always taken the train to work and back home. If you're going to drive cross-country for your retirement, my advice would be get a new car and learn how cars work. I didn't either, and that's the only reason this story happened. So I got back in the car and we discussed our options. They consisted of waiting or praying or waiting and praying. We chose worrying and bickering instead, just for fun. Then something walked out of the woods and stared at us, and we stopped our petty quarreling, as we now had a far bigger problem. We were now being stared down by the Pennsylvania Dogman. This was a wolf man, really. It had a wolf head. It had gray fur all over. It was tall. It stood on its hind legs, and it had glowing yellow, orange eyes. It was your classic Dogman. It looked at our vehicle in a confused manner and sort of seemed cute and funny for a second. Then it spotted us moving inside the car, and it dove onto our hood, trying to get at us through our windshield. It was as though it didn't know what glass was, and it drooled all over the windshield, trying to force its head through at us. I could see its teeth all the way up to the gums, and I wondered if it actually could gnaw through glass. My wife shouted at me to lock my door. I asked why. The thing doesn't understand what glass is. How could it open up? But before I could finish the thought, it was on her side of the car, using both hands to try to pull her car door open. I still, to this day, cannot answer my own question. How does a creature too dumb to know what glass is know how to open a car door? But if she hadn't locked her door, that's exactly what that thing would have done. So I locked my door. This was the fastest moving and most manic animal I have ever witnessed. It jumped on top of the car and tried tearing through our roof. It tried getting in our trunk. It tried all four doors. Then it tried to push the car over with its shoulder. It went back onto our hood and began again trying to gnaw through the glass when a car approached from behind us, and it ran into the bushes. I could see it watching from there, ready to pounce back out at us, but when the car slowed down on our left and stopped, I think it ran away. At the very least, it ran deeper into the woods. It turned out the guy stopping was highway patrol. He came to my window, which I rolled down for him, and he leaned in and got a good look at both of us. "Aren't you folks a little too mature to be necking alongside the road?" he asked us with a chuckle. After we explained that our engine conked out, he opened the hood and gave us a jump. Then he told us where there was a hotel and an auto repair shop where we could get a new battery, as he said something about how this one was on its last legs. We both thanked him profusely and drove directly to that hotel. The room was smelly and overpriced, but it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. My wife said the same thing too. We were both just so relieved that we had gotten away with our lives after being trapped by the Dogman. We'll be right back with 2 hours of Dogman stories right after this.
Get your Bigfoot for President t-shirts, mugs, buttons. Get them now. cafepress.com/Bigfoot for President.
I'm Henrey Lee Dogman, and today we've got a particularly creepy story, so let's get right to it. It's called The Dogman of Crybaby Bridge. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this is a story of how I went out legend tripping with my cousins in Michigan, looking to see a ghost or maybe ghost lights, but ended up seeing a Dogman instead. This all happened last winter. I was out staying in Michigan with my uncle and his family on Christmas break in my senior year in college, and hanging out with my two cousins, who we can call Trevor and Nigel, just because I know they would seriously dislike being called those names. We kid each other a lot, as you can tell. I have no brothers, and those two are the closest thing I've got to it. So one night I asked if there were any good ghost lights or haunted roads or anything like that we could go legend tripping to. My uncle suggested we check out Crybaby Bridge, so we Googled it, and it turns out there are more than one of them. In fact, there seem to be 10 or more Crybaby Bridges across the United States, and we found 2 in Michigan alone. The one he was referring to was closer to us, and there was another one much further away. Interestingly, both are located just south of the Great Lakes, which are bodies of water that many strange things have been reported in. I suggested we go to the nearby one first, and if nothing happened, we could take the 2-hour drive out to the further one away. None of us had to get up early the next day, and we were all hyper from watching a scary movie, so we decided to make it an all-night adventure. We grabbed some snacks and beverages and piled in the car, with my aunt insisting my uncle drive us, since it was already getting kind of late. We reached Wilder Road right around midnight, the witching hour. The place is spooky as all get out in the middle of the night in the winter, and I was excited. I really expected something to happen. I think we all did. Now, the legend behind this particular Crybaby Bridge is that a woman back in the 1800s discovered her baby boy was missing. She went out into the cold, snowy night searching for her son, but never found him. Then she froze. According to the story, if you go to the Crybaby Bridge and honk your horn 3 times, you will hear the baby crying, or else you'll encounter the ghost of the woman, who will demand that you tell her where her baby is. In some versions, she's supposed to chase you down the road or even attack your car. There are variations upon variations. In some versions, the baby was taken from the house and both he and his mother were done away with. In other versions, they drowned in the icy water under the bridge. I found this the creepiest of the Crybaby Bridge stories and was excited that we'd be going there first. I had a feeling we'd be so scared after visiting that location that we'd forget about the second Crybaby Bridge, which, as I said, was another 2 hours of driving past the first one. But just in case, I studied up on that second one as well. That one is located in Metamora, Michigan, on Wilder Road. I'll give you the deets when we get to that part of the story. So we got to Morrow Road around midnight, like I said, and it took a bit of driving before we found what we think was the bridge in question. None of us were really sure if that was the correct place, though. I think they redid the area recently before we went there, as things looked a lot different than they had on Google Maps. At any rate, we parked and got out, but left the motor running. None of us walked away from the car, and in fact I had my hand on the door handle just in case I needed to get back inside in a rush. We challenged each other to beep the horn, but it turns out we had all gotten ourselves pretty frightened. Or I guess I should say pre-frightened. And finally it was up to my uncle to beep the horn for us. If someone angry comes running up, he warned us, it will more likely be a neighbor trying to sleep than any kind of ghost. To him this was all funny, but I shushed him, wanting to listen closely to hear if there were any baby crying sounds or sounds of the mother. We kept our eyes peeled and looked all around, shining our flashlights in every direction, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Trevor suddenly got in the car fast, slamming the door behind him hard. This almost gave me and Nigel a heart attack, and we dove inside the car too, wanting to know what Trevor had seen or heard. He told us he hadn't seen or heard anything. We asked him why he jumped in the car like that then, and he said he just counted to 100 in his head, and since nothing happened, he got back inside the car. His father / my uncle started kidding him, and we joined in, but he insisted he wasn't scared. He was just ready to go on to the next Crybaby Bridge. I asked that we please sit and listen for another couple of minutes before moving on, and so we did. I wanted to videotape the area with my phone, but I ran out of space only a minute in. After 2 minutes, my uncle asked if we were ready to head home and turn in. I said no, very emphatically. We hadn't had any luck on Morrow Road, but we still hadn't tried Wilder Road. My cousins chimed in, agreeing with me, so my uncle rolled his eyes and put the car in drive. My cousins started filming with their phones as we headed to the second location, both running out of space or battery power before we were halfway there. The GPS in the car started giving us incorrect directions, and this frustrated my uncle, who had us all checking for a better path on our phones. We were taken far out of the scary mood we had started in, and I was beginning to wonder if we had made the wrong decision continuing the trip at all. Maybe we should have gone home and fallen asleep to a monster movie or something instead. I decided we should tell scary stories to get back in the mood, but nobody else was really into it. When we finally, after 2 hours, saw the bridge on Wilder Road come into the headlights, I think I was the only one still into it. This Crybaby Bridge is in Metamora on Wilder Road. The story behind it is set in more recent times than the other and involves a mother driving home with her son in the passenger seat. Suddenly, upon reaching the bridge, her engine mysteriously stalled. She got out of the car to see if she could figure out what was wrong with the engine, but found nothing out of order. When she returned to the car, however, her son was now completely gone. The poor woman went searching for her boy but never found him, freezing to death in the cold night instead. Some people say they can still hear the baby crying, and others say they can see the woman still searching for her boy. Others claim that their car stalls out when they're on the bridge, which probably to me might be the most frightening possibility. So this bridge, out in the middle of nowhere, is alleged to not only be haunted, but deadly. I tell you, that bridge looked ultra creepy in the dark, and I felt a major chill run through me. Rather than putting the car into park like last time, my uncle watched as the car ground to a halt by itself. The engine turned off with a sound like someone choking as they were drowning. We all piled out of the car. My uncle pulled up the hood and began checking out the engine. My cousins and I walked onto the bridge, which is a clunky old thing. I looked over the edge of the bridge and saw the water rushing past underneath. It instantly made me feel dizzy, and I had to pull back from the edge. It wasn't like I was afraid someone would push me over or anything paranoid like that, but it felt like I was going to fall forward out of my own control. I brushed off the feeling as me just being tired and made a mental note not to get that close to the edge anymore. I told the others that if there was any truth to the story, then probably both the baby and the mother had been washed away by the water. It was going so fast that if one of us fell in, it would have taken any of us away with it before we could do much to save ourselves. My uncle slammed the hood down and my knees almost buckled from the loud noise. We all laughed in relief that it was just him and not the bridge collapsing or a ghost coming after us or whatever. Trevor gasped, and we all jumped. "What is it?" I wanted to know. He remained silent for a second. Then he said it was nothing. When we asked him to explain, he said he thought he had seen a ghost light off in the distance, but then he realized it was just an airplane flying by, very far away. My uncle called out to warn us that he was going to try the car engine. He said he didn't want any of us wetting ourselves from the shock of the noise, and we all laughed. The car started on the first try, and we all let out a little cheer. We may not have gotten to get scared by anything, but our good mood had returned at least. However, it was not to last long, as fate had other plans. When I was about 15 feet away, the engine failed again, and the car lights all went out. This completely blinded me, and I would imagine the same thing happened to my cousins as well. I stopped in my tracks, not wanting to trip over anything in the dark, and waited for my eyes to readjust to the lack of light. I pulled my phone out of my pocket to use the flashlight app, and I listened intently as my cousins joked with each other and my uncle cursed under his breath. I think he was about to get out and look under the hood again, but all at once, the four of us heard something that made us all shut up. There was a growling. There was a deep and a very loud growling. My uncle shouted, "Mountain lion," but it didn't sound like a cat to me. I shone my light around until two blinding yellow lights were caught in its glare. The animal I was now illuminating took a step back in surprise, then bared its very white teeth, which shone almost as brightly as its eyes did in the limited glare. To say that the beast was large would be an understatement, but it was not a cat. It was some kind of a dog. A large dog. I thought that its eyes were almost level with my own and started walking back toward the car, never taking my eyes off the canine. I think my cousins were already back in the car, but I'm not sure because I didn't want to miss a second of what I was seeing. Then, the yellow-eyed, huge, dark dog stood up. It was now far taller than any of us. I don't want to estimate size, because I'm terrible at that, but my uncle insists it was over 7 feet tall when he tells this story. The sickest part about that is that it didn't really stand up tall like a man exactly. It was kind of bent over or hunched over, holding its front paws or claws together, sort of like a kangaroo or maybe an Allosaurus dinosaur was supposed to do. The big thing began running toward us and was there at the car within maybe 4 steps or 5. I was just slamming the back door as it reached the front of the car. I locked the door a second or two before he was around my side, slamming on the car windows with both hands. I guess I don't really mean hands. I mean paws or claws, but they were so large, they had to be larger than my own hands. I don't really remember if it had an opposable thumb, but I bet it could pick things up if it wanted to. I was screaming to get us out of there, but my uncle was shouting back that the engine was dead. The dog was racing around the car like it was insane, trying to break in any place that looked vulnerable to it. Trevor was shouting as loud as I was to his father to get him to turn the key in the ignition and try again to start the car. Finally, my uncle got so frustrated, he took the keys out and gave them to his son. Trevor scrambled over his dad to get in the driver's seat, but in the process, he dropped the car keys to the floor. At this point, the dogman did something even more surprising than anything he had done before. He jumped on the car roof. Fishing around on the floor for where the keys had dropped, Nigel found them first and inserted the key. Trevor put his hand over his brother's and they turned the ignition together. Nothing. Trevor turned it again, and the car whined and wheezed, nearly starting, but not quite. Then we all heard a sound to the rear of the car, and to our utter horror, that dogman's head lowered itself upside down in the back window. All 4 of us screamed like little kids, and that dog thing, he just watched us the way a cat watches a goldfish in a bowl. I saw his breath coming out of his mouth and nose in the form of steam. It fogged up the back window from outside, even as our panic fogged up the windows from the inside. Trevor turned the car key again, and this time, it started. Immediately hitting the gas pedal, Trevor skidded and bumped us over the old metallic structure, and we were soon on the other side. Finally, we were free of Crybaby Bridge. The only remaining problem was that we had a feral, angry Dogman on the roof of the car. I don't think Trevor even had a driver's license yet, but instinct kicked in, and he swerved left and right like you see the stunt drivers do in the movies. He came close to side-swiping trees several times, and we all shouted and screamed each time he did. He was trying to get the Dogman to fall off the roof. Apparently, the Dogman figured that out too, because he did some kind of a backflip and landed just behind us on the road, on his hind legs, and facing us. He started to race after us, and at first it looked like he was going to catch up. Trevor screamed a high-pitched scream and took us faster. The Dogman dropped to all fours and began closing the gap again. Finally, Trevor just held his foot down on the gas and focused intensely on keeping us barely on the road. "We're all gonna die, we're all gonna die, we're all gonna die," I could hear him saying, but after another 30 or 45 seconds of his stunt driving, I could see the Dogman fading into the distance. Trevor said he had to stop the car, but his dad urged him to keep going another minute or two. Somehow, he held it together, then screeched the car to a very long and slow halt. Before we were even fully stopped, he was out on the road, hurling all the junk food he had eaten all night. Nigel got out and dragged him to the back of the car. I opened the door and Trevor got thrown on top of me. As soon as Nigel was back in the passenger seat, my uncle hit the gas. I was still pulling Trevor into the back seat, but he didn't care. I looked behind for the Dogman, but did not see him, and managed to get my cousin in, closing and locking the door behind him. He smelled horrible, but at least we were all alive. My uncle drove for 5 or 10 minutes before remembering that he lived in the opposite direction. He got off onto some highway heading back south and east, and we took a very different route home, avoiding any haunted bridges that we had heard of. So, that was the first time I ever went legend tripping, and you know what? That was also the last time I ever went legend tripping. In addition, that was the last time I will ever go legend tripping. And you know why? It's all because of the Dogman of Crybaby Bridge, the haunted Dogman of Delaware. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I'm a retired banker living alone in Delaware, and I don't know if Dogman is supposed to live here, but I have seen one. I can't say for sure that I've seen one living here, but I have definitely seen one over and over and over again. My story began after my wife passed on. I wanted to move out of my house because the memories were too thick and heavy for me to cope with. My friends urged me to get an apartment in a senior complex they lived in, but I opted to move a bit further out into the country and get a small cottage with enough grounds and small woods that I could wander in. I wanted to try to feel a sense of belonging to the world again, as I had been put into an alienated bubble by everything that had happened. This house had all that, plus cable and Wi-Fi, so I moved in eagerly, taking only what I needed and putting the rest in storage. It took a few weeks before I noticed the odd thing about the place. There was a strange-looking man on the property, and he would run around by the wood line 150 to 200 feet behind the back window. As I said, I hadn't noticed it at first, but it was while vacuuming up dirt from a plant I had accidentally knocked over that I caught sight of the guy out of the corner of my eye. He was running from one patch of woods to my right to another on the left, and he seemed to be dressed all in black. I thought about calling the police, but whoever it was had already passed. As long as he didn't come back, I really had nothing to tell the cops, so I let it drop. About a week later, I noticed the exact same thing, and this time I made note of the time. It was 11:52 at night. The next night, I was waiting for him to see if he was punctual. Oh boy, was he. Exactly at 11:52 p.m. Now, my curiosity was really being raised. The next day, I went into the mall and got myself a good pair of binoculars. This time, when I saw him running past, I wanted to get a look at his face to see if it was anybody that I knew. Well, I got the surprise of my life. It was definitely not someone I knew. Okay, 11:52 arrived. I squinted at the wood line. There he was. I lifted the binoculars to my eyes and quickly adjusted. I got a clear look at him just as he entered the woods to my left. My heart was beating, pounding in my chest, and my brain was unable to process what my eyes had seen. If my eyes were correct, that man had a dog's head. It seemed to be a man wearing black with a dog's head mask. That was completely creepy. That's not someone you want running around your place. Again, I thought of calling the police, but again, I realized nothing would be here when they got here. I needed to gather some evidence. Then I could show the photos to the police, and they could get here by 11:51 and arrest him right on the spot. That seemed to be the most logical thing to do. So the next day, I went to the mall and got myself 4 trap cams. I set up the cameras on various trees along his nightly run and set them to go off if anything moved past the front of them. That night, I watched from the house with my binoculars, already knowing where the guy ran out from and already having my eyes trained on the exact spot. I was stunned, as this time I got a much better look at the guy. He wasn't wearing black clothes, not at all. He was covered in dark fur instead. He wasn't a man with a dog head mask. He was a dog that ran upright. At the same exact time, every single night. I was so excited that I wanted to run out and get those trap cam chips to see if it had gotten any good shots. But the idea of coming face to face with an upright running dog did not seem appealing. So I decided it would be best to wait until the morning. Besides, maybe he would run by again later, maybe after sunrise. Maybe I would get lucky. The next morning, I got up early and practically skipped out to my cameras and jogged back into the house. I hadn't been so excited for years. Maybe I had discovered a new species. I couldn't wait to check the chips in my computer. So, imagine my surprise when chip 1 showed a photo of a flying sparrow, and number 2 showed the belly of a squirrel. Number 3 and 4 showed nothing at all. Nothing had tripped them off at all in the previous day. I went back outside and reloaded the cameras, moving 3 of them to different trees on different angles. One of them I put at such an angle that it should catch the entire run. I was certain I had blanketed the area and that at least one of them would need to get at least one good photo of that thing. That night, in my binoculars, I noted details I hadn't noticed before. The dog's tongue did not hang from its mouth as it ran. The dog ran like a man, its arms swinging to the sides as it did so. Its arms looked more human-like than dog-like, but its legs were just like the hind legs of a wolf or other canine. And so, that night, I dreamed of the thing. I dreamed of it running on my land. It was hunting in my dream, and it was happy or at least content. It was living out its life purpose out in the wild, hunting smaller prey. I felt as though I knew the creature. No, I felt almost as if I were the creature. At least, I should say I felt great empathy toward it and knew it to be a real animal, at least in the dream. It wasn't a man in a costume. It wasn't from outer space. It wasn't from my imagination. It was an animal that ran on its hind legs, and it was out hunting game. I woke up feeling certain that I knew what the thing was, and certain that I had some good snaps of the animal on my chips. I did not. Nothing. I got no photos of anything interesting. Baffled, I went into the mall to complain that the cameras weren't working correctly. Although when tested in the store, they worked fine. The guy allowed me to exchange them and get this other set that took video instead. He also sold me a setup of a camera that I could leave running all night and record off of a monitor in my home. Now that thing would finally get caught, and I would have the proof I needed to show the world that this thing was real. That night, I watched with my binoculars as the monitor was set up by my side. When the creature appeared, I looked directly at the monitor, and what I was seeing out the window was not showing up in the video. Sure enough, the next morning, there was nothing on any of the videos. No sign of the running dog man. I felt so flummoxed and exhausted from my efforts that I invited myself to go stay with my friend Ned back in that retirement apartment complex I told you about before. I explained the entire story to him, and he asked if he could come out to my place to see the creature himself. Of course I said yes, but I had a feeling he would see nothing. Just like the cameras hadn't seen anything. I was beginning to wonder about my sanity, and judging by the expression on Ned's face, he was too. So it felt like a lot was at stake the next night with Ned over. I couldn't relax all evening, and I was a nervous wreck. I dropped a plate and it broke. It was that kind of a night. So, finally, when 11:52 came around, I just wanted to get this over with. At last I could find out if I was insane, or if this thing was real, and I could then begin to decide what I should do about any of this. I had given Ned my binoculars, but told him to try to see the thing with his naked eye first. Right on time, I witnessed the creature running along his usual path. Ned gasped aloud before I could even say anything, and I knew he could see it too. He held the binoculars up to his eyes and followed the path of the creature, his jaw hanging slack in amazement. I stared at him for a few minutes, as he seemed to be in a bit of shock. Finally, Ned spoke. "Well, either that thing really ran by, or else we're both crazy." We had a good laugh and a better brandy, and he asked if we could go to a different room to hang out and talk this over. He didn't feel right in that room anymore. He had really been shaken up by all of this. And so, we sat up and talked till dawn, trying to understand what we had seen. We went to bed, then immediately Ned sat up, having had a realization come upon him just before sleep. "It's a ghost!" he shouted. "A ghost?" I asked, confused. "Who's a ghost? Where's a ghost?" Ned explained that the Dogman must be a ghost. Otherwise, why did it appear the same time and do the same thing every night? It was stuck on a tape loop, repeating the same thing it had done in life. Maybe it was recorded into the land right there, the way video can be recorded onto chips or discs or tape. "Apparently not like video," I said, "or we would have some proof, wouldn't we?" Yet, still, to this day, that's the best theory I have about what that thing is and why it's doing what it's doing. Also why it can't be photographed. The whole thing ceased to be a fun distraction and became a concern of mine. Is that all we are after we're gone? A collection of recordings at best, and not even that at worst. Was there anything left to my lost wife? Would there be anything left to me once I was gone? I moved out of that house and into the apartment complex with my friends. We keep our days occupied and mostly we're pretty happy, all things considered. I moved away from the Dogman without ever finding definitive answers one way or another. I still don't know what it was or why it was. I bet it's still there, but I don't want to know. It feels like the greatest failure of my life that I didn't find out the secret behind the haunted Dogman of Delaware. The 1970s. Bell bottoms. Watergate. The rise of alternative cultures in the mainstream United States. What began in the 60s expanded in the 70s. It was an era that saw the beginnings of New Age perspectives in spiritualism, as well as witchcraft and Satanism. There were bands with names like Black Sabbath that later admitted they didn't know the first thing about what their name even meant. It led to young people sort of making up their own versions of the dark arts based on rumors and lyrics from the back covers of vinyl albums. This next story we're about to tell you is about a particularly dim-witted group of young adults. And in fact, that's not our description of them. That's how they're described to us by the original storyteller himself. He claims this is all true, but he could be pulling our leg, so we're not going to make any such claim. We're just going to tell you the story, which asks the mystical question, did my stupid friends accidentally summon Dogman? Dear Scary Stories. A lifelong friend of mine passed on recently, and it got me to thinking about some of the crazy adventures we had when we were younger. Back in the 70s, he fell in with some hard partying guys that I didn't care for. I never saw them when they weren't messed up in one way or another. When he would hang with them, I would find something else to do, and soon I got invited along less and less. Little did I know my instincts were correct, because those two guys ended up being the reason that my buddy and I came face to face in the forest in the dark of night with what you might call a dogman. I don't think my friend and I had seen each other in weeks when we randomly ran into each other at the supermarket. One thing led to another, and we ended up hanging out the rest of the afternoon and getting reacquainted with each other. By the later afternoon, he was urging me to go with him that night to the forest, where he and those two stoner dudes were planning on summoning a demon. I rolled my eyes, but somehow got talked into it. I was hoping to be able to pry my friend from those two guys, and it seemed like the more I knew about the dumb things they did together, the better chance I would have to convince my buddy that they were bad news. While we walked to the meeting place, my friend kept telling me that his friends wouldn't mind if I came along, and when we found them, that turned out to be very true. They were so blotto, I don't even know if they realized I was there. At this point, the story starts to get a little more complicated, so let's assign fake names to the people involved. Let's call my friend Alvin, and why don't we call the others Tweedledum and Tweedledummer? They were interchangeable as far as I could tell. Although I don't want to use anyone's names, I have no problem admitting where this took place, which was south of Harshaville in Raccoon Creek State Park. This is in Pennsylvania, but pretty close to West Virginia. My friend and I were really city folk, having grown up close to Pittsburgh, but Alvin's buddies were originally from somewhere over there, maybe even West Virginia itself. I never really cared enough to ask too many details about them. They had a real local accent, whereas Alvin and I spoke more like the people on the TV. At least we thought we did. My wife told me to the day she died that I had a Pittsburgh accent, but I don't hear it, and I don't even know what she meant by that. So, we finally reached the woods and wandered deeper and deeper into it, trying to find a place where nobody would see or hear whatever silly ritual these guys had created, which they thought was going to summon a real demon. When we got there, they had this little record player, a kid's record player, battery operated, like something you would bring with you to the beach in those days before MP3s or even CDs or cassettes. Or maybe we had cassettes by then, I forget. I remember we had 8-track cassettes at least. But these guys, they brought their kiddie record player and pulled out a record that I thought was by Anton LaVey or some guy like that. I've Googled it, and it seems LaVey's music wasn't released until the 1990s, so it must have been someone else. At any rate, it was not heavy metal. It was just odd and disconcerting instrumental music. In my memory, I remember thinking it sounded like horror movie music, so maybe that's what it was. Now, Dumb and Dumber drew a circle in the dirt and grass at a bit of a clearing along this path, and they set candles up on the edge of the circle. The scary music played in the background, and I was starting to get a little more freaked out than I had expected to get. I was told to stay inside the circle at all times, or I might get taken by the demon. I think they got that idea from a Night Gallery episode. It started not to seem as funny to me as I expected it to be, and I did what they suggested. When the quote-unquote ceremony began, one of them started chanting in broken Latin that he probably got from a movie or something. His chant went on, and I heard some names of characters from H.P. Lovecraft stories mixed in with the Hollywood fake Latin. The longer he went on, the harder it became not to laugh at the idea that this ceremony was real in any way whatsoever. When he declared, in English, that he was going to sacrifice a life for the demon, then he pulled out a chicken wrapped in paper that he had obviously gotten at the butcher shop, I couldn't hold back my laughter any longer. I fell down, laughing hysterically. That's how funny it seemed to me, and that's how relieved I was that these guys weren't going to actually sacrifice anything or anyone. The three of them got annoyed at me and asked me what was so funny. I informed them that sacrifices usually involved living animals, and I totally took the wind out of their sails. Really? Asked one. "Are you sure?" asked another. Sheepishly, they discussed whether or not they should continue the ceremony anyway. Just then, we all heard a rustling sound in the forest around us, and we froze in place, silent. I don't know about the others, but I wasn't frozen because I was afraid of a demon. I was afraid of being caught by a park ranger, or maybe a serial killer or something like that, or a bear, if bears are in that forest. I don't have any idea what lives in there, since that was the only time in my life I ever visited that park. My friend Alvin whispered to all of us that as long as we remained in the circle, nothing could hurt us. Not a demon, and not a park ranger either. What walked out of that forest, though, was not a demon or a park ranger. In fact, even though I got a good look at it, to this day, I'm not sure exactly what it was. I mean, it was what you guys would now call a dogman, but what does that mean exactly? It seemed very physical. It smelled like a wet dog, and maybe that's what it was. It was standing on its hind legs and walking, or should I say, creeping along. It held its hands, or paws, but I remember them as hands, in front of it, and it was a little bent over, and it creeped along looking sneaky in the process. I mean, it looked like a villain from an old movie. It was acting like it was up to something. This thing had tall, pointed ears like a dog or a wolf. The fur was sort of grayish like that of a wolf. A dark gray is what I remember. It stood like a man, but I don't recall any details about its legs. I don't remember if they were dog-like or human-like. If I ever saw one again, I would look at the legs to see, but I think that night, all I really noticed was that it had tall ears, angry eyes, and long, sharp-looking teeth. I saw it as something large enough to take me down, and that overruled any other facts about the incident. At this point, my version of the story would always diverge from Alvin's version, as Alvin felt to the day he died that this was a genuine demonic visitation. I think it seemed far too natural to be a demon. Alvin remembered the thing having glowing eyes, I forget what color. What I saw had very dog-like eyes, and its pupils were open as wide as possible, making its eyes very black. So it must have been in a very excited or agitated state. Maybe Alvin saw the candlelight reflected off its retinas, I don't know. It was undeniably terrifying looking though, unlike anything I had seen before or since, outside of the movies or TV. Tweedledum or Tweedledummer started insisting angrily that we stay within the circle, while the other one began shouting curses at the monster, insisting that it had to obey him and was not allowed to come any closer than it already had. The dog-headed, hairy, upright walking creature turned its head sideways and stared at the guy as if it were trying to comprehend the words he was saying. After appearing to consider what to do next, the dogman took another step toward us, and we all screamed like babies. The one idiot started chanting loudly that he was banishing the demon, and the other one told me and Alvin that we were safe as long as we stayed in the circle. Alvin was crying and unable to speak. He seemed to be trying to form words, but nothing coherent was coming out. That's how I felt too, but even more so, I felt my survival instinct kick in. I ran away, back in the direction we had come from. I didn't just run like a chicken. I ran like a chicken with its head cut off. I heard terrible screaming and noises from behind me, but I never looked back until I was out of the park, not till I was home, to be honest. I didn't hear from Alvin until the next morning when he called me on the phone. Back then, the phone meant the landline in the small house I lived in with a roommate. Boy, was Alvin mad. He said that because I had left the circle, they were no longer able to command the demon, and it entered the circle with them. They all ran away and got out without being eaten, but apparently one of them had twisted their ankle, and Alvin's face and arms lost some fights with a couple of thorn bushes. Now, my version of the story is that this was not a demon. It was some kind of wild animal, and I ran away for my life. Alvin's version was that it was a demon, and my escaping the circle is what gave it power. I reminded him that his dumb friend had told the creature not to come any closer. Then it did come closer anyway. Therefore, they never had any control over it. And most likely, reason number one was that predators in the forest don't understand English, Latin, or H.P. Lovecraft lingo. They just understand how to kill and how to eat. Alvin was sore with me for a while, but eventually he realized those two guys were dummies, and we became friends again within a few months, and stayed friends till the day he died. But he never relented from his belief, which I think is bizarre, that the Dogman we saw was supernatural or demonic in some way. I don't personally believe in the supernatural, and I don't believe in demons. To be honest, I don't believe in werewolves or Dogman either, even though I saw what appeared to be one that night. I don't have any answer to what it was. Maybe it was a mass hallucination that we all experienced. Maybe it was a deformed bear or an undiscovered species. Whatever happens in life seems to me to always have a natural explanation. Just because I don't know what the explanation to that experience was, doesn't mean that there isn't some logical one to it. I'm sorry if that isn't what you want me to say, but I just don't think pretending to speak Latin and then attempting to sacrifice a Purdue chicken is actually going to summon a Dogman or anything else. But just in case, for your own safety, please do not try this at home. It seems the Dogman felt generous that day, allowing 4 7-course meals to escape him. That doesn't sound very supernatural or demonic to me. Either the Dogman must have let them go, or else it has limitations in what it can do, more limitations than a paranormal demon would have. At least, that Dogman did, assuming there's any truth to the story at all. Our next story claims to also present the argument that this is a natural creature we're discussing here. It's about 2 generations of Dogman, and it's coming up right after this.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
Dogman Dynasty. Dear Scary Stories. My story takes place in Hulbert, Michigan. It started about 6 or 7 years ago maybe, and part 2, which is the real kicker, happened just 10 or 11 days ago. In each case, it involved me seeing what might possibly have been a real-life Dogman. Now, the first time I saw what I thought was a Dogman, I admit I had been imbibing. I had also been quarreling with my girlfriend. We started arguing inside the bar on Maple Street across from the post office, and we got asked to leave by the bartender. We went outside and continued disagreeing with each other, so I stormed off. I don't know if I was being a hero or just out of my mind at the time, but I stormed off into the woods behind the bar. Maybe I just wanted to go someplace I knew she wouldn't follow. I had the keys to my truck, so I figured she couldn't go anywhere without me. Once I walked into the trees, it got quieter all right, but it also got cooler, and I suddenly had to take a leak. Doing my duty by a tree, I heard something moving around closer to me. I tried to hurry up, but I had been drinking beer, and it seemed to be taking forever to finish. Meanwhile, I could hear whatever it was getting closer. I suddenly got the notion that it must be my girlfriend coming after me to apologize. This seemed funny, and I started laughing and calling her mean names. I was shouting various insults at her and telling her she better beg me for forgiveness or I wasn't going to drive her home. When suddenly, I saw what it was, moving around. If that was my girlfriend, she'd gotten very tall in the minute since I'd last seen her. I tried to zip up, but was having trouble with my manual dexterity, so I started jogging out of the woods while finishing my business. I am grateful I was stewed to the gills, because if I hadn't been so sedated, I think I might have had a heart attack. I thought it was a bear, an incredibly tall bear. As I got closer to the back of the bar, it got a bit more well lit, so I turned around to try to catch a glimpse of the bear. Well, I saw it, but it was not a bear. It was standing like a bear, and it was walking after me, but it walked like a tall, lanky man, not the way a bear walks when it goes bipedal. It took long, sure strides, bopping along, and clearly could catch up to me without having to speed up very much if it wanted to. It was a light gray color, but had spots and stripes all over it. Spots on the belly and cat-like stripes on its sides and arms, probably on its back too, but it was facing toward me. Its eye shine was blinding. I found that after I looked away, I saw trails where the eye shine had burned into my eyes. I've never had that kind of experience with any other animal in my life. I ran to my truck, and my girlfriend was not there. I looked back and saw the creature still coming toward me. I drove out of there like a maniac, and my hands were shaking badly. I swerved all over the road as I attempted to speed home, but I got picked up by an officer that I knew personally. He told me he had to give me a ticket, but I foolishly started ranting that there was a werewolf after me, and he gave me some of those drunk tests. I failed everything, and even though he was my friend, he took me into the station to sleep it off. I woke up in the morning not knowing what parts of that story were real or not. When I got home, I checked my messages and found that my girlfriend was informing me that we were broken up, and she had already found a new guy in the bar, so I shouldn't ever call her again. I fell into a depression which lasted months and pretty much forgot about the Dogman for a few years. Okay, so cut to recently, like I said before. I was driving along South North Hulbert Road, which is pretty close to that bar I saw the big spotted creature at, right? What do I see kneeling by the side of the road, eating roadkill? Another gray striped Dogman. At first, I thought it was the same one that I saw that earlier night, but this one was too small. It was maybe 5 feet tall if it had been standing up. I mean, it was on its knees, so that would make it look smaller, but that thing that night in the forest was so tall, I had to look up to see its nasty, painful eye shine. This one was much smaller, and most likely younger, too. That's when it dawned on me. This must be a son or daughter of the first Dogman I had seen years earlier. This monster had his own dynasty going on. It was one of the most exciting moments of my life, but I didn't slow down because, small or not, that thing looked terrifying. No, I didn't try to take a picture. I just tried to put as much distance between myself and that thing as quickly as I could. I felt deeply afraid of it, but I don't know if it ever even noticed me driving by. It was so intent on what it was doing. Even though both those creatures scared the daylights out of me, I weirdly identify with them and feel happy that somehow they managed to exist into the modern age. That is, unless I hallucinated them both times. But the second time, I was completely sober. Or, well, basically sober. Almost sober. I can't say I would ever want to see one again, but at the same time, I'm glad I got to witness a Dogman dynasty. Habituated Sasquatch or Dogman, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. My Uncle Caleb had been having a feud with my side of the family since before I was born, but once he fell ill, it dawned on him that he had nobody on his side of the family to leave his stuff to. That's when he reconciled with my mother and father, and that's when my brother Sam and I got to meet him. I'd heard stories that he was an angry and difficult man, but by the time we got to know him, he was pretty sick and mainly stayed in bed. He was very friendly to me and Sam, and we got to like him a lot very quickly. He would tell us things we would need to know if we kept his house, or things we'd need to tell the next owners if we decided to sell it. He told us stories about the history of the house and the forest surrounding it, but most interesting to us was when he told us about the Bigfoot he claimed was living around the property. He told us he left a giant-sized can of Alpo dog food out at the tree line before going to bed each night, and that it was a tradition he had started almost 60 years prior, when he first built the house with the help of his friends. The first few months living there were difficult. Someone or something kept racing past the house at night and hitting the outer wall loudly. Sometimes it would hit the windows and shatter glass into the rooms all over the floor. Uncle Caleb said he went to an old witch lady who used to live nearby in those days, and she told him it was a forest demon. He asked her if that meant he should pray, and she just cackled and laughed at him. He had to pry it out of her that the forest demons weren't demons in the traditional sense. They were physical beings like you and me, he was told, but they're demons still in the same. She told him that was their hunting ground he built his new house just on the edge of. He was going to have to make them a regular offering of something they could use, like food. He asked the old lady what forest demons ate, and she told him, meat. Any kind of meat. Scrap meat is fine, but you better put it out every night before going to bed if you want to get any sleep. My brother and I wanted to know if he was kidding us, but while we were asking him, one of the neighbors came over and said he had just fed the demons for Uncle Caleb, and they discussed neighborhood matters before he left. So Uncle Caleb was being serious about this. He fed what he felt were the local demons as a bribe to keep them from smashing his house up. Sam and I wondered if this entire neighborhood was insane. He had only told us about this, not either of my parents. That made us wonder if it was a joke, but it might also have meant he just didn't expect my parents would believe him, while we might. Sam asked our uncle outright what these demons looked like. He told us he had seen one of them come for the food several times, but the creature always reached out and grabbed it with his hand from behind the foliage. The most he had seen of the animal was its forearm, which was hairy like an ape, only colored brown. It was lighter fur than a gorilla or a chimp, but darker than an orangutan. It had nails on it much longer and scarier looking than he had ever seen on a monkey, though. He said they were like monster claws. He gave us his opinion, which had hardened into fact in his mind many years prior. This was a Sasquatch, maybe more than one of them. This was Bigfoot, like on Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of. It was the real deal, and our uncle made us swear on our lives that we wouldn't mess with it. Either we feed it, or we make sure the next owners feed it, or we clear it out of the way because that animal or man or whatever it is can get more than a little crazy when it's hungry. After college ended that summer, we were allowed to go live at Uncle Caleb's place and help him with things around the house that he was too weak to do himself. The very first night, Sam and I put out the dog food as we had been instructed, over by this big old bush that smelled terribly. Then, we booked it back to the house and set up station in the front room by the windows, ducked down so that we could see out, but hopefully nobody could see in. Our plan was to wait up and watch the food get taken so we could see this supposed Sasquatch for ourselves. Well, we fell asleep, and in the morning, the food was gone. We walked out to retrieve the bowl, which was completely empty. That bush didn't smell as badly as it had the night before, though. Sam was grouchy, and he said we were probably just feeding raccoons or possums, and that the whole thing was stupid. He told me that night he was going to sleep in a bed like a normal person, and the coyote could eat all the dog food they wanted in peace. So that night I stood vigil myself, swearing that nothing in the world could make me go to sleep before I saw what was eating that dog food. Instead, I must have fallen asleep even earlier than the night before because it wasn't even midnight yet when the window I was sitting behind smashed inward loudly, waking me up. I barely closed my eyes and turned away in time as glass shards flew every place. I got some minor cuts, but it could have been much worse. I didn't see the thing, but I did get the impression of something big running away. I could feel the heavy footsteps. It sounded like a football player, so I felt pretty sure that Uncle Caleb was right. At that moment in time, I was absolutely certain that I had just annoyed a large, angry bull Sasquatch or Bigfoot. So the next day, my brother made me tell him the story over and over and over again as we drove into town to get a new window, and again and again and again as we installed the new glass panes. Now, he was fascinated and wanted to stand guard that night so he could see Bigfoot for himself. I told him he could do it by himself because I was done picking glass shards out of my hair and clothing. Uncle Caleb gave him an idea for a safer place to watch from. Upstairs on the second floor, behind a special window Uncle Caleb had put a reflective surface on the outside of years prior. If you kept the lights out in the room, it worked as the kind of two-way mirror that the cops use. As long as he stayed quiet and in the dark, my brother should be able to get an eyeful. I didn't care anymore. It was too overwhelming for me. And so that night, I just went to sleep in bed. The next morning, my brother was glum at breakfast. He told us he saw what was eating the dog food, and it wasn't any Sasquatch. We asked him what he saw eat the food, and he glared at us and asked, "What would you expect to eat dog food?" Neither of us had an answer for him, so he shouted it out at us. "Dogs eat dog food? That's what eats dog food. You've been feeding some stray dog for years." He said he saw the bushes part around 11:30 at night, and he said the head of the biggest dog he had ever seen poked itself out through the leaves and just ate the food up out of the bowl like it was nothing. He never saw that much food get eaten that quickly, so the dog must have been really massive behind that bush. None of this made sense to either me or Uncle Caleb, because there was so much about it that didn't fit. If it was just a dog, then how could a dog have smashed the window that night? And what I saw running away was a large bipedal creature. If it wasn't Bigfoot, then it must have been a large man. Sam guessed that maybe the two things were unrelated. Maybe there's a large stray dog eating the food, and maybe there's a large crazy man that smashed the window on me. But that didn't make much sense either. Confused and wanting to understand what was going on, that night I sat up in the room with the two-way mirror. I took a nap in the afternoon and made a big pitcher of iced coffee to keep myself awake. Sure enough, a little bit before 11:30, I saw a dark brown or black dog head with tall ears emerge from the bushes. It had the strangest eyes I'd ever seen on a dog. They glowed yellow. When I say glow, I mean just that. They reminded me of lightning bugs, except the glow stayed on all the time, and the color was less green and a slight bit orange. The creature seemed to be nervous or suspicious. It was looking around as though it knew something or someone was watching it. I saw it staring intently at the now fixed window. Then it just kept looking around. Eventually, it froze right on my window, and my stomach did a flip. Could it see me? Did it sense me there somehow? I looked around, but all the lights were out in the room. It shouldn't be able to see where I was. Still, the large dog's glowing eyes stayed focused on me, or on the window a few inches from my face. Then, I saw the creature's head pull back into the woods. It hadn't felt safe enough to eat. It had left the food in the bowl. I was stunned, and I was about to stand up and run out of the room to wake my brother up and tell him the news when I saw something that made my blood run absolutely cold. Out of that same bush, something emerged once again. It wasn't a dog's head this time, though. It was a hairy, hand-shaped claw. Just like Uncle Caleb had said he had seen almost 60 years prior. I screamed and was so surprised that it took me some time to even realize that the screaming I was hearing was coming from me. The dog in the bush realized it was me, though. I saw its head poke back out of the forest. It poked out far enough this time that I could see that the claw holding the food was connected to the dog's head. That meant it was not a dog. Dogs don't have monster claws, they have paws. Dogs don't have hands, they don't have opposable thumbs. Dogs can't walk out of the woods holding a bowl of dog food in their hand because, as I already pointed out, dogs do not have hands. This thing had hands. I saw it walk out of the forest all hunched over, and at the shoulder, it had to be almost 5 feet tall. And then it stood up and looked at me, and it sort of barked and sort of roared. I ran out of that room so fast it was almost like I was flying. As I passed through the door frame into the hallway, Sam was flying into the room to see what just roared outside. We ran smack into each other and both fell over backward. Sam got up first and literally climbed over me to get to the window. He told me later he saw something that looked like a large, hairy man walking back into the forest and disappearing in 2 incredibly long steps. So at that point, we separated into 2 philosophical camps. I said it was a werewolf living in the area, and I was laughed at by my brother, who said there was a Bigfoot habituated on the land, as Uncle Caleb had told us. I asked him, if it was a Bigfoot, then why had he seen a dog's head eating the food? He thought about it, then suggested that maybe the stray dog sometimes eats Bigfoot's food, and so that's when he gets mad and breaks a window to complain about it. My brother thought he was using Occam's razor to decide the issue, but in his version, there now had to be 2 mythical monsters on the property, and that seemed far too complicated an answer for me. It was a werewolf, or what we now call a dog man or a wolf man. There was nothing else it could be as far as I was concerned. That day, we drove into town and got a trap camera. It was a night vision camera that was set off to go anytime it detected motion in front of it. All we had to do was set it up during the day and make sure it pointed at the spot we always left the food bowl at. Then, that night, we'd drop off the food, run back to the house, and go to bed. The next morning, maybe the camera could tell us exactly what we were dealing with here. So we set up the camera in the afternoon, and that night when we went out to put the dog food in the usual spot, we saw that the camera was no longer attached to the tree we had put it on. Walking over, we saw it on the ground, smashed and crushed like something had been bashing it in with a sledgehammer. So much for that idea. So that night, a large rock was thrown through one of the windows on the 2nd floor. Uncle Caleb said the creature had never messed with the upper floor before, especially not on a night when it was left the dog food. If it was now going to eat the dog food and attack anyway, Uncle Caleb wasn't sure how we could remain safe. He had always argued before when my parents suggested moving him into hospice, but now he brought up the idea as if it were his own. He was clearly stressed by the increased activity of what he and Sam still called a Bigfoot. It was not helping his health get any better, and it had put rings under my eyes and Sam's too. It definitely seemed like time to retreat. We moved Uncle Caleb home with us the next day, and within a couple of months, he was in a place where he could be more properly cared for. We left a supply of dog food with the neighbor, but he informed us that the house was getting trashed a little more each night. Leaving the dog food didn't help anymore, and even abandoning the house didn't make things better. That dog man, or Bigfoot depending on your worldview, was no longer willing to be appeased by anything or anyone, any way or anyhow. So, we are still set to inherit the property when Uncle Caleb passes, but none of us have any idea what would be the right thing to do with it. It doesn't seem ethical to try to sell it to someone, and it doesn't seem safe to try to live there. My brother has come around to partially believe what I told him I saw happen, but he still insists I saw a Bigfoot. He says it was just a Bigfoot with a longer snout, so I thought it was a dog. I reminded him that he had seen a large dog before I did, and he said I must have had that on my mind when I dreamed I saw the werewolf. Whatever I would say, he would have a smart response about how it was really a Bigfoot, even though it clearly, to me at least, was not. If only we could have gotten a photo, but the thing was too smart for us. Sam claims he's gonna go back to the house again at some point before it starts to snow and try to see how much stuff he can get out of there, see how much hasn't been completely wrecked yet. He asked me to go with him, but I told him I'd rather chip in to hire movers instead. I really don't want to go out to that house again unless I absolutely have to. If the area were infested with Bigfoot, that would be scary enough, but that forest has a dog-headed man with monster hands running around in it. How could that possibly be a real thing? And yet I saw it with my own eyes, and my brother saw it too, even if he doesn't understand that he did. Maybe it will turn out to be a good thing if Sam goes back there. Maybe he will see it again. Maybe he will get a picture of it or something we can have tested for DNA. Maybe Sam will solve the puzzle once and for all about whether Uncle Caleb's property is inhabited by a habituated Bigfoot or a Dogman. Demonetized by Dogman. Dear Scary Stories. When I was in my early 20s, my rich uncle gave me a few $1,000s on the condition that I go hiking and quote-unquote find myself. I wasn't even sure what that meant, but I enjoyed money and I enjoyed goofing off. Traveling around with a backpack and sleeping under the stars sounded an awful lot like goofing off to me, so I took the money and off I went. If I knew I'd be about to encounter something that looked exactly like a real-life werewolf, I'm not sure I would have been so eager to agree. Before sending you this story, I tried to figure out exactly where it took place, but I wasn't really able to. I did manage to narrow it down a bit, though. I don't think I was in Ricketts Glen Park in Pennsylvania, but I know I was near it. On Google Maps, there's this green area northeast of that park, which is labeled as a state gaming land. I think that quite possibly could have been where this took place. I know I had passed through the town of Noxon, and I was heading roughly west. I passed near other settlements and followed dirt paths until there were no paths to follow, so I trailblazed directly into the woods until I found a body of water. It might be the one in the screen grab I sent you, but I'm not 100% sure. The fact that Google Maps doesn't even give that lake or pond a name shows you that I was in some uncivilized area, definitely off the beaten track in a quite literal way. So, I was initially going to set up camp on the small beach surrounding the tiny lake or big pond, but something told me not to. I'm not sure what it was exactly, but when I went to the water, I felt as though I were being watched. So I found a tiny clearing inside the trees and hung a hammock there. I set up my tent, but I did not set up a fire since I didn't want to burn the woods down. I had hippie food with me, as I used to call it, a bag with nuts and dried fruit and M&Ms, that I had mixed together, picking up different things to add to the mixture with each town I passed through. So, in that sense, my diet was ever changing, but I always ate out of that same heavy-duty plastic baggie. For me, life was good, but it sure was about to change drastically. My first and only night at that body of water started normally enough. It was a warm night, so I slept on my hammock, leaving my backpack and wallet and everything except my bag of hippie food and water bottle zipped up in my tent. Sometime after dark, I woke up needing to relieve myself. Wandering off into the woods half awake, I began to think I was hearing noises coming from my camp. At first that didn't seem so strange because I had been dreaming that I was camping with friends. But then I had to stop and think. No, I was camping alone. My friends were back home, miles and miles away. I listened more closely, trying to make out any further noises. After a while, I decided I must have been dreaming the sounds, but it made me feel very frightened and very alone. Now I was nervous to walk back to camp at all. I began to think that in the morning I should resume trying to find myself from the inside of a hotel room. All the fun I had been having camping evaporated in those few seconds, and I wished I could be anywhere except where I was. No matter how hot the night was, I felt a chill, and I started shivering a bit. Walking back, I tried to stay as silent as I could. My eyes had gotten adjusted to the darkness, and I looked down before making each step to avoid stepping on twigs or branches. Listening, I could hear nothing more coming from the area of my camp, but as I got to the edge of the very small clearing I had set up in, I saw something very unexpected. I saw an animal in my camp, a large one, but it was walking around on its hind legs like something out of a horror movie. This was definitely an animal, though, because it had animal ears on top of its head, and it had a long, full tail behind it. My hippie food bag was ripped up and my food strewn all over the ground. My water bottle had been stepped on and emptied. The thing was facing away from me, somewhat bent over, apparently studying my tent. I was close enough to hear it breathing heavily and got the impression it was sniffing around, possibly searching for either food or prey. Then, suddenly the beast sharpened up to attention, sniffing more intently than before. The quickness of its movements alarmed me, and my instinct was to run. My curiosity won out, though, and I stood there, continuing to watch what was happening in front of me. Then, so suddenly that you can't imagine, what was happening in front of me was that the creature had caught my scent. I realized the wind was at my back. They say that's a good thing, but it isn't when a very large predator is to the front of you, as he now knew that I was behind him. Quicker than a thought, the thing turned its head, and suddenly I was making direct eye contact with something that resembled some ancient Egyptian god more than it resembled anything else. This was a dog-headed, upright creature, but it was not natural looking in any sense. It was not as though a bear had evolved to look dog-headed. No, This was an intelligent, very strange type of creature. Not human, but not human. Maybe it really was a werewolf. My mind didn't turn to that as an answer, though. I thought this was a space alien, as strange as that might sound, or at least some other kind of intelligence from somewhere else, or maybe descended from a species that did not originate in the forests of Pennsylvania. I'm not 100% certain why I felt that way, but probably the main factor was the way its eyes glowed. It was not eye shine, or at least it could only have partially been eye shine. The eyes seemed like very bright lights, piercing, yet not painful to look at. I felt like I could stare into them all night long, yet they were very, very intense. And they were intelligent. This was a thinking creature, and its eyes betrayed that. But this was not an intelligence that wanted to make friends with me, as evidenced by the angry look it took on less than a second after its initial expression left. It turned its body around to be fully facing me in one graceful move, then began running toward me at a sickeningly fast speed, so I only got to see it from the front for less than a second. But I will try to describe what I remember seeing before I turned and ran. This guy, and I'm assuming it was male, although in the darkness I can't guarantee that, this guy appeared like a welterweight boxer. It was probably a little under 6 feet, but still tall enough to be terrifying. I had seen a big boxing show once in New York City, and this guy was not a heavyweight, but he was an athletic and strong-looking welterweight. His arms were like human arms, and his legs were like dog legs. It didn't look as though it could run on all fours except in the way a human can, but it looked very natural up on its hind legs. Nevertheless, like I said, those were big, thick dog legs under him. I've read in more recent times about the Wisconsin werewolf, which holds its dog-like arms in front like it's praying when it walks. This was not that. This was like a man's torso and arms in between a dog head and dog legs, with a bushy dog tail behind, and red, glowing eyes like a space alien or maybe some kind of demon from hell. I got the sense that its teeth were deadly, but I can't lie. I only looked into its eyes and got impressions about its silhouette, mainly from my peripheral vision. That thing took 2 steps toward me before I could even turn away from it and start running. But when I did start running, I didn't stop for a long time. I was in a complete panic. My mind was gone, and all that still remained of me was survival instinct. I could hear the dog barking behind me. It sounded just like any other dog, or at least any other very large one. The further I ran away, the more the barks faded into the distance, so it had not followed me into the trees. It was just scaring me away from entering the clearing again, kind of the way a guard dog will scare an intruder away from a yard, but then not follow it once it's begun running away. Even after my brain had digested all that information I just told you, I kept running anyway. My fear kept me going. It was pointless. I was no longer being pursued, but what had happened had so shocked me that I became a running machine. Soon, I was lost and exhausted. I collapsed to the floor, panting, and fell asleep. I woke up in a funny position leaning against a tree, and my neck ached from the position I'd been sleeping in. I was completely confused as I awakened, at first not even remembering who I was. Then I wondered where I was and why I had been sleeping on the forest floor. Eventually, everything floated back into my brain, and I realized I had to try to make my way back to the camp. I looked up through the tree canopy above and saw that the sun was just barely beginning to change the sky from night into other kinds of colors. Having no idea which way I had come from, I looked around for my own footprints. The ground was pretty hard and dry, so I was lucky to find anything, but I was fairly certain I had come from this one direction, and that was the direction I headed back in. Now, all my stuff was in that tent, so I absolutely had to get there. I had my wallet hidden deep in that backpack, and I was carrying hundreds of dollars on me. It wasn't like now where you can check into an ATM and take out what you need. Those hadn't been invented yet. Back then, you carried cash, and you carried a checkbook, and maybe you carried a credit card, but I didn't have one of those yet. So I had taken out $500, of which there was over $300 left, and I had my checkbook, and that was it. My driver's license was in that wallet as well, and I needed that to be able to cash checks. Sometimes you could get store owners to cash checks for a fee. Sometimes pawn shop owners would do it. And if you were lucky enough to find a branch of your bank in some of these small towns, they would cash a check for you as well, but not if you didn't have proper identification. So without my wallet, I was going to be in big trouble. I walked until the sun came up, and I kept walking after that. I knew I was lost and counted my blessings when I found a trail. Even if this didn't lead back to my camp, it would lead to something. After walking along that for a while, a guy came up, and I ran to him asking for directions. He made me slow down and explain what had happened to me, and he seemed very understanding and very kind. I spilled out my entire story, that a big animal had scared me away from my tent near the lake, and that I needed to find my wallet which had all my money in it. He told me to calm down and head back in the direction I'd been coming from, and that I would find the lake in about 25 minutes. I thanked him profusely and headed back the way I'd been coming, feeling greatly relieved. About 35 or 40 minutes later, I realized the guy had lied to me, and I doubled back. My thinking was that I must have been close to the lake when he misdirected me, or else he would have told me to walk much longer. He must have only needed 25 minutes to get to my camp and take what he wanted from it. That must have been the reason he chose that length of time. So I doubled back, running, and about an hour later found another person who directed me correctly to the large pond. Finally finding my camp late in the afternoon, I saw that my hammock had been ripped from the tree and seemed to have been torn up. I guess that was the Dogman's doing. Then I noticed my tent was unzipped, and I knew that was the act of a human thief to be precise. Entering the tent, I found all my belongings strewn about, torn out of the backpack, and my wallet was on top. Opening it, I discovered all the cash gone. But thankfully the creep had left my ID and my checkbook. I packed up as quickly as I could, needing to make my way out of Dogman country before dark and desperately needing to find a check cashing establishment of some kind for survival reasons. That's a whole other story I could tell of what happened from that point. I was starving before I got something to eat again late the next day, but I did survive. It took me over 20 years to get up the nerve to go camping again after that experience. I spent the rest of my uncle's money on a bartending course and a small apartment. Fear of going hungry ever again became my prime motivator, and I was a city boy from then on, or at least a townie. I like being in crowds, and I have a deep fear of being alone or in the wilderness, because going into the wild on your own invites a situation where you could end up demonetized by Dogman. I dreamed of Dogman. Dear Scary Stories, I once had a dream about a Dogman. So what? I can imagine you saying. Well, my dream came true. Well, sort of. Let me explain. This happened in the summer just before my last year in high school. My sister went to the same school, but she was a sophomore going on junior at the time. She went camping with some of her friends over the summer break at one point. I think it was either right before or right after the July 4th holiday, because I remember she was around for that. Anyway, out of nowhere one night, I had a dream about this big bad wolf guy. He was all black, really tall, but he stood on his hind legs and was smart enough to taunt me. Like one time I told him, "You aren't real," and I could sense him saying in return, "And yet, here I am." In the dream, I was walking home alone at night through some kind of abandoned ghost town. I walked down the middle of the street because I could sense him in the shadows, ready to reach out and grab me. Sometimes I would see him, and his face was so terrifying I would wake up in horror, sweating profusely. I had to change my pajamas, sleep on the other side of my bed with a new pillow, sleep on the floor on the rug. That's how much that dream had made me sweat. Once I went back to sleep, the big bad wolf was always there again, and I knew he would be. This time, he was chasing me through the forest. I was so tired in the dream I just wanted to sleep, so I kept hiding in places and resting while I watched him walk by. Then he would see me, and I would have to run again. In the dream, he finally caught up to me, and I woke up trying to scream, but unable to. Again, I was drenched in sweat. There was no way I wanted to go back to bed anymore after that, so I just got up and started my day a couple of hours early instead. Okay, fast forward to the next week when my sister got back home from camping. She acted normal and told our parents that everything went well and that she had fun. When she got me alone, though, she told me that their last night in the woods, they had seen a werewolf and that it had chased them right out of the park they had been camping in. I wanted details about what that meant. A werewolf? Was it Lon Chaney Jr. chasing her? But what she described, you can guess it already, can't you? She described a big black wolf that stood like a man and sent out waves of fear from itself. She said it was the scariest thing she had ever seen. It pursued them like it hated them, and it seemed far too intelligent to be just an animal. She told me she would never go camping again, and as far as I know, she still hasn't, to this day. I told her about my dream, and she just thought I was trying to steal her thunder. She thought I was jealous and making the dream up, but it was absolutely for real because I dreamed of Dogman. And now, get ready for an all-new, completely uncensored, slightly bloody, and absolutely terrifying new Dogman story. Oh, wait. YouTube won't allow me to tell you stories like that on this channel. If you want to hear that, you're going to have to go to peterbernard.com and sign up for our paid subscribers club You can choose any price you can afford for a 1-month subscription, and then every weekend, we tell you a story YouTube would never allow us to tell you on this channel. See you this Sunday for an all-new, very scary, completely uncensored Dogman story.
The Dog-Headed Man of the Woods, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. I grew up in my grandmother's home. I never knew my real parents. Grandma lived near the woods just outside of a town, and she was very old-fashioned, although it took me a long time to figure that out. We had no real neighbors, and she homeschooled me until I was 13, so I didn't know much about life except what she told me about it. And Grandma's world was full of such creatures as fairies, puckwudgies, Bigfoot, hide-behinds, and Dogman. When I was a kid, we heard a lot of noises coming from the woods. I would look to Grandma, and she would tell me a little story to explain the origin of each sound. Sometimes we would hear wood knocking, and Grandma would tell me it was the wild man of the woods communicating long distance. She said, when I heard that, I better get inside and lock the doors because those tree knockers might be talking to each other about me. Sometimes we would hear speech outside our windows at night, and I couldn't understand what was being said. If the voices were high-pitched, she told me they were fairies, and if they were deeper, more guttural voices, she told me it was the trolls or the hide-behinds, who were both hairy men, but from different tribes than the hairy men of the woods who did the tree knocking. One night, we both heard a noise that sounded like the wind itself calling my first name. Grandma looked utterly terrified, which upset me. She never looked nervous about any of these creatures as long as we were inside and had our doors locked. But whoever was calling my name outside the house that night genuinely frightened my grandmother. I asked what it was, and she at first said she didn't know. She grabbed my hand and we went upstairs to her bedroom, locking the doors and windows and pulling the shades. She told me to stay the night in that room with her, and no matter what happened, to not look out any of the windows. After Grandma was asleep, I heard a tapping on my window just to my right. This terrified me because that window was 25 feet off the ground. I didn't get up, and I didn't look. Not even after whatever it was started calling my name again from right outside that thin pane of glass. I pulled the blankets up over my head, stuck my fingers in my ears, and hummed until it finally stopped, and I fell asleep. Over breakfast, Grandma told me that it might have been a puckwudgie, since they will lure you to your doom. It also might have been a skinwalker or evil magician from one of the native peoples. Might have been a ghost too, she said. Sometimes ghosts get hungry, and they try to lure you out of your home and eat your soul. Then again, maybe it was just a crazy stranger, I thought, but Grandma never mentioned that possibility. Everything in Grandma's world had a magical or supernatural explanation. And so, when we heard dogs howling in the night, they were only rarely coyotes or wolves. More often, they were the dog-headed man of the woods. She would never look frightened when we heard them, but she would lock the house up and we'd spend the rest of the evening upstairs on nights when the dog-headed men were on the hunt. Sometimes, on those nights, we heard horrible sounds that Grandma wouldn't explain to me. I could only imagine what had fallen prey to the Dogmen that time. Grandma said that both the dog-headed men and the hairy men were tribes of other kinds of humans. They didn't like us but respected our boundaries as long as they felt we respected theirs. If we were found wandering on their turf, that very well could be the end of us. As long as we were locked in our homes while they were hunting or bringing their young through the area, they would usually tolerate our presence. The things that knew your name, though, those entities made Grandma genuinely uneasy. I don't think she understood what they were or what their intentions or capabilities were, although she tried her best not to let me know that at the time. So I grew up, went away to college, where I learned that not only were most people not familiar with dogmen and monsters that hovered outside second-story windows calling your name all night, but they didn't even believe such things existed. And you know what? They didn't exist, at least not at the dorms I was staying in. The big world outside was a lot brighter and more fun than living inside the dark, haunted forest of my grandmother's vivid imagination. I found myself, when I thought back on events from my childhood, rationalizing them and explaining them away as different and more normal things. Maybe the sound calling my name was an owl, or a hole in a fence that the wind was blowing through. Maybe it only seemed to be saying my name. Maybe our imagination filled in the blanks. Maybe the tree knocks were natural branch breaks or trees tipping over in the wind. Maybe they were deer hitting their antlers on branches. Everything that had happened before high school now seemed a lot more mundane to me, and this made me glad at the time. It felt a lot less stressful to only have to figure out how to get along with the human species and not to worry so much about Grandma's extended menagerie of intelligent hominids. So, Grandma died, and she left the house to me. I never went back, and I never put it up for sale. I didn't want to think about it or deal with it. Then I went through a rough patch in my adult life, both at work and with my significant other. I needed a break from both, so I decided to finally go out and check on the house. I could clean the place up and try to not think for a little while. When I got to the old house, the nostalgia was intense and almost overwhelming. It felt like someone put two backpacks on my back at once. I realized that it was my responsibility that I was avoiding by not coming to this place. My responsibility to wrap up the loose ends of the life my grandmother, who had raised me as her own and got nothing in return for it but to be left to die alone. It was responsibility and guilt I was hiding from. So, like a worker who hates his job, heading back to the grind on Monday morning, I trudged inside and rummaged around for the mop and the broom. No vacuum cleaner, of course, as Grandma had never had electricity run out to the house here. I wondered if there were cell reception and checked my phone. It looked like I was getting a little, but there was no Wi-Fi in the area. I tried a mobile hotspot, but it kept jamming halfway into loading. Coming to this place really was like stepping back in time. Suddenly, a loud wood knock broke me from my reverie. I stood up at once and wanted to run outside, but I laughed at myself. There would be nothing to see. That had taken place somewhere in the forest. I felt excited with every part of my body and spirit to hear that sound again. Some people tell me about nostalgia for seeing an old TV show or movie from their childhood, and I can't really relate since we didn't have a TV set. But suddenly, hearing that tree knock, I felt like this was the same thing for me as nostalgia for Saturday morning cartoons might be for a city kid. I felt very grateful to have experienced that and said a brief internal prayer of thanks. Something whispered my name. Something outside the window whispered my name. Then, it did it again. Could that be an owl? Could that be the wind blowing through a hole in a tree? This only happened one time in my childhood, so why would it by chance happen a second time so many years later on the first night I came back to visit? I heard my name being whispered again, so I opened the window and looked out. I saw nothing, just the back area of the house and the forest past it. Still, this was my chance to find out what around here makes a sound so close to my name, a thing I'd been wondering about my entire life. So I got dressed quickly and ran downstairs and out the back. I just stood there and looked around. I could only hear a breeze. I couldn't hear any animals, and I couldn't hear any crickets. That was strange, not to hear crickets in the forest at night. Then I heard it again. I heard my name being called in that exact same voice from my childhood. It definitely came from my right, from within the forest, so I took off in that direction, running as fast as I could. There was something there. I saw the shadow of something standing behind a tree, and I ran directly toward that figure. I no longer heard anyone calling my name. As I got within 5 or 10 feet of the tree, the shadowy figure stepped out into full view. I looked up and saw its massive, muscular, hairy thighs. I looked higher and saw its belly, covered in lighter fur than the legs. Looking up further, there was the chest of a young Arnold Schwarzenegger, blown up to even more giant proportions and covered in dark, thick fur. On top of this massive chest was the head of a very angry-looking dog. It was the dog-headed man of the woods. It had arms on it that looked like they could crush a Buick LeSabre. Not front legs, but arms. It was a hairy man with a dog head. I fainted like a little girl. I'm not proud to admit it, but that might have saved my life. If this creature is anything like a bear, maybe playing dead was really the best thing I could have done. All I know is I woke up at the first rays of dawn sunlight with a headache and smelling an ammonia smell everywhere. It took me a while to comprehend that I was laying on the dirt outside, and a bit longer to understand that the ammonia smell was coming from me. The memory of the dog-headed giant flooded back to me quickly, and I ran back inside the house immediately. I knew in my head that the creature must have left hours ago, but I found myself shaking all over as though the incident were still going on. This thing I saw was much larger than the normal description I've been finding online about dogmen or werewolves. This was like the Hulk in the recent Marvel Comics movies, whereas the normal Dogman report is more of a creature like the Lou Ferrigno version of the Hulk. This thing really seemed like a special effects creation more than a natural animal. I think part of why I fainted was that even though my grandmother told me over and over that these things exist, the actual appearance of it was so over the top and so more than natural that my mind couldn't wrap itself around the existence of this monstrosity. All I know is I had left that house alone for too long. It was a few years. Not only did the creatures around here no longer remember my smell, they had probably forgotten about my grandmother by now as well. They had all reclaimed the house as their turf, and it would be too dangerous for anyone to stay there any longer. The newer generations of the various creatures might not respect Grandma's old turf. They might even come inside uninvited. No, it's too dangerous a place now. That forest is haunted. I'm in negotiations with a nearby wildlife preserve to annex my property, but there's swampland in between us that we're trying to purchase and include in the deal. I told this story to a city friend of mine, and they insisted that the monsters of the woods were all creations of my grandmother's and my imagination. I said, so what? By this point, they're fully real. I don't know if those things were always there, or if Grandma invented them, but either way, that cabin now belongs to Dogman.
Dogman gave me insomnia. I apologize in advance if some of what I say doesn't make sense. I haven't slept in 3 days, or 4 days maybe. I know I need to sleep, but when I do, I dream about that face, that demon dog face I saw at my window, and then I wake up screaming all over again. Ever since I've seen it, I can't get it out of my mind. I can't escape the face of the Dogman. It feels like as soon as I fall asleep, the dream begins again. I know it's not supposed to work like that, so maybe it isn't. Except it is. The Dogman is in the woods outside my house. When I sleep, I start to dream, and he tries to break in to kill me. Then I wake up, and usually there's nothing there. It was just a dream. One time, I woke up and the Dogman was there, his face in the window. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking around at the interior of my room like he was casing the joint. Maybe he was. I turned on the lights and foolishly blinded myself. By the time I could see clearly again, the Dogman was long gone. I don't know if he walked away or if he vanished. Was he really there, or merely a hypnagogic projection? The thing that started all this was not a dream, and not a hypnagogic projection at all. I was alone in my living room, watching some comedy movie from the 80s or 90s, and a large figure just walked up to one of my living room windows, bent down, and peered in at me. It was a very tall, very dark figure, and when I saw its face, I screamed and stood up. This guy was wearing the ugliest and most terrifying looking Halloween mask I'd ever seen. It moved and writhed as though it were attached to an actual face, as though it were the face of an actual monster. I ran up to my bedroom like a small child. I had no weapons in the house. I got my old aluminum baseball bat out of my bedroom closet, and I slept with it that night, but it was a fitful sleep. The next night, I went upstairs at dusk. I didn't want to risk seeing the face again. The idea that this huge, monstrous thing was everywhere around me, that it had free reign while I was paying the rent just to be locked in my bedroom all night. I obsessed over these injustices. I seethed over the unfairness of it. But when I would start to get up the nerve to go downstairs, to claim my own house as my turf, I would hear him. Maybe I might hear him howl. Maybe I might hear him run past the house and hit it, then keep running on. I've put the house up for sale, but I can't move till it's sold. My own family won't take me in. They think I'm crazy. I just need some sleep. Do you know a safe place I can get some sleep? Do you know a place where I can stay? Do you know a place where I can get some sleep?
If you enjoyed this, please click like or consider subscribing. Remember to click the bell icon or you won't get notifications. If you want to listen to Bigfoot's secret uncensored story each Sunday, just go to peterbernard.com and become a paid subscriber. See you tomorrow. Same dog time, same dog channel.